Hey everyone, welcome to the third annual Brain Binge. We're happy to continue this tradition at Final Girls Berlin, which is a film festival for horror films made by women and non-binary filmmakers. We also hold talks and panels and workshops, and we're keeping the Brain Binge going as sort of an extension of something we started during the lockdown. And I think it's great that we can keep engaging an international community of horror bingers. I don't know what else to call you all. So I'm really excited to have Sally Campbell here today, who we've also met at the festival a couple of times in person. Sally Campbell is an editor by trade and is based in London. She has just completed a master's in film and screen media at Birkbeck College, University of London. Formative teenage experiences include being served a tiny chicken for Christmas dinner while watching Eraserhead on VHS with her family. And
Mhm.
Sally is going to be delivering her talk, The Mother and the Other, Involuntary Childlessness Through the Lens of Horror. So I'll hand it over to Sally.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that was a great Christmas in the 90s. Um, so my talk is looking at a group of people who I think often are missed out in some of the new discussions and new literature around women in horror, around reproduction, bodies, and all these kind of questions around motherhood, um, childbirth, and the family, and so on. And that's the involuntarily childless. So, of course, there are childless women in films who are young women who it's kind of assumed they might have children later, or there's the sometimes there's characters who have chosen to be childless who are often portrayed in the past as femme fatale, dangerous women. But I'm looking at the women who want to have children but can't or haven't been able to for whatever reason. um, so the picture on this first slide is from a Peruvian film called El Vientre, excuse my pronunciation, which means the womb, I believe. And so this is a film from 10 years ago. And it's one that I hadn't seen or heard of before I started researching this topic for my master's dissertation. Because when I started looking for literature around the question of involuntary childlessness in film, there's hardly any. And there was two studies that I found. One was a short piece about this film, and El Vientre is about a wealthy middle-aged widow called Sylvia, who is the woman we see through a keyhole here. And she's someone who's experienced lots of pregnancy loss and stillbirth in the past, whose husband we learn probably had something to do with this. He was a gynecologist and may have messed with her reproductive organs, and she may have killed him. All of these things are hinted at in the film. And she kind of uses her wealth and power to hire a young woman from the village to come ostensibly as a housekeeper, but actually as an involuntary surrogate to fill this empty cot that she has in her big empty house. Um, and this film is significant because it's Peru's first kind of horror-ish film, psychological thriller. It stands very much in the tradition of some of the other films that I look at, Fatal Attraction, Hand Rocks the Cradle, the kind of American films from the late 80s, early 90s. Um, and it and it was significant because it pays homage to those films in some of its themes and the way that it operates. And it was good to be able to find that and make it part of the study, because what I found when looking for films featuring involuntary childlessness as a key theme, again, there aren't very many. Um, and I think there's two factors that led me to want to look into this. One is that kind of heavy silence that exists in society at large about involuntary childlessness, that is then mirrored also in culture. And the second thing is this, the rise of all this new literature and feminist horror studies and so on, and the new wave of horror cinema. that is looking at taboo subjects, difficult issues in different ways and new ways, and to see if there's something that could be said about this issue through some of the new films, or if anything had already been said. One of the books that I found really useful in my research was Women, Monstrosity and Horror Film, Gynae Horror, by Erin Harrington. And this is a really excellent contribution. It looks at horror dealing with women's reproductive bodies through lots of stages: adolescence, motherhood, childbirth and pregnancy, menopause, and the end of fertility. But even in this really excellent book, there's no real direct discussion of involuntary childlessness in terms of the kinds of characters that are portrayed. You know, there's a bit of discussion of it in a chapter on science and reproductive technology. And again, I think this is largely because there aren't many films to look at. It's a taboo subject, partly because of the shame associated with infertility, whether biological or situational, whether it's because you don't have a partner at the right time, and so on. And that's true of women who are unable to have children, and how that makes them feel about themselves, about their womanhood, you know, their success or failure in their role in society. It's also true of men who are involuntarily childless, and they are barely ever mentioned at all. And I'm continuing that tradition simply because I'm focusing on women in this case. But infertile men are rarely mentioned, or if they are, then it's with a kind of ridicule of. Involuntarily childless women are represented generally as desperate, as dangerous. You know, they are coming for your husband, they're coming for your baby, or they want to replace you in your family home. They are made monstrous as they pursue the ideal family unit, or they wreak revenge on the family for their exclusion from it due to infertility or pregnancy loss or death of a child or loneliness or lack of a partner. There's usually a backstory, but it's often quite minimal or just hinted at. And there's, in the films that I found and that I looked at, there's very little room for sympathy for these women. And the other thing that they all, or nearly all, have in common is that they will die. The other major study that I found when doing this research was quite a big study from Oslo University by Christina Archetti, called No Life Without Family, and that's from 2019. And she looked at 50 kind of mainstream films, so not particularly at horror, from all genres, featuring involuntarily childless characters as a major part. And it's the only serious study that I could find on the subject. It was part of a broader project across different departments, I think. And she was looking at cultural representations of voluntary childlessness. And she found that these women, right, they either die or they become normal by acquiring a child in a kind of mystical way. And the third option is that you are allowed to live without children, but only if you have a world-saving mission. So the example she gives is Black Widow in the Marvel films. Black Widow is a Soviet-trained assassin, and this assassin program of training included forced sterilization. She refers to herself in the film as a monster in conversation with the Hulk. You know, she's like, "You think you're the only monster in this place." Now, it's interesting that the author of this study talks about Black Widow because, of course, in the next film, after she'd done her study, presumably in Endgame, Black Widow precisely dies. She sacrifices herself in favour of another character who is a parent who has children. So, you know, she judges that his life is more important than hers because he has a family and he doesn't. So, you know, this kind of idea of the value of childless women is something that recurs throughout the films, some of the films that I've looked at. And yeah, just to run through the main films that I look at. There's the two American ones from the late 80s, Fatal Attraction, 1987, and The Hand That Rocks the Cradle from 1992. These are more psychological thrillers, but in both of them, the main character is made into so monstrous by the end of the film that they feel like a monster from a horror film that has to be put down in the most brutal way. So, Fatal Attraction, I'm sure many people have seen it or heard about it. It's about a family man, Dan, who sleeps with a woman, Alex, played by Glenn Close, one weekend, and then she won't let that affair go. You know, he treats it as a one-night stand. She wants to continue it and starts to stalk him and harass him and so on. And in the end of the film, he becomes this kind of completely monstrous and irrational figure who turns up at his house, threatens his wife with a knife. He tries to drown her in the bath. You know, she does the classic movie monster thing of coming back to life at least twice, I think. And then the wife shoots her and kills her. In The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, this one is about a psycho nanny. You know, this is a film in which the Rebecca De Mornay's character Peyton was pregnant, married, and her husband was a gynecologist who it turned out had been sexually assaulting patients, including this woman played by Annabella Sciorra, who reported him. Other women then came forward. He killed himself. And so Rebecca De Mornay's character turns up a few months later, unbeknownst to our main characters, the wife, the widow of this doctor, and she gets hired as the nanny in their home. She, after her husband killed himself, she lost her baby and was given a hysterectomy. So she's got no chance of having a baby, biological child in the future. And he tries to replace the mother in that household or steal the baby that will do for her. She's killed in the end by the opposing mother figure who pushes her out of a window where she's impaled on a white picket fence. The next film is known in English as Lullaby. It's a French film from 2019, I think. Yeah. And this again is about a nanny who is kind of doing a stealth home invasion, wants to take over the mother's role, baby in particular, and also with their 5, 6-year-old daughter. She comes in and seems very nice and efficient, is, you know, kind of sneakily trying to take over the household. This film is based on or inspired by real events that took place in New York a few years ago, and it's based on a novel by Leila Slimani. It's a strange film, and again, kind of adjacent to horror. It's got a lot of horror elements in it, but it also has echoes of The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. À l'intérieur, inside, as it's known in English, is the most extreme horror of the ones that I looked at. This was another French film. It's from 2007. And this one is about a woman who has recently been widowed whilst she was pregnant. She's about to give birth the next day. She's going to be induced in the hospital. And she faces a home invasion from a mysterious woman who has kind of witchy elements about her and who seems intent on stealing her baby. It's a quite brutal battle that takes place over the course of the night. And then there's Involuntary, which I've already talked about. The other one I'll come back to later, Dead Ringers. This is the remake of David Cronenberg's film from the 80s about identical twin gynecologists and their clinic and their weird kind of abusive relationships that they're involved in each other and with other people. This was a remake produced and starring Rachel Weisz as the twins, and really bringing it up to date and doing quite different and interesting things with the idea of these. And in this case, one of the twins is trying to get pregnant, has been experiencing pregnancy losses. And so the direct question of involuntary childlessness is there, but also it raises a lot of issues around the profit motive in healthcare, around class and who has access to healthcare, in the ways in which women or pregnant people are not allowed to be involved in decisions about their own bodies when they come to contact doctors. So very interesting, and I'll come back to that later. But I would say, in all of these films, the childless woman is portrayed as a monster in one way or another. That element hasn't really changed in the 35-year period that these films span. But what has changed to some extent is the willingness to show the struggles of motherhood. So in Fatal Attraction, the earliest film here, Dan's wife really doesn't have a personality. She's not given a personality. She is simply a mother figure and a wife figure. And she is perfect in both those regards. The weakness in that household, in that family unit, is the husband, who can't even be trusted to be left alone for one weekend. Not only does he sleep with someone else, he doesn't even feed the dog. He's like completely useless in the household. But in some of the later films, and particularly the two French ones, Lullaby and Inside, the mothers are made vulnerable by their loss of identity, by how hard it is to be the mother of a baby, or to be facing single motherhood as Sarah in Inside is. And these are also the two films in which there's not a clear ending of the childless woman dying. I mean, in a sense, in Lullaby, she kills herself. She also kills the children. You know, so mother doesn't win in that sense. It's not a battle between the mother and the other, with the mother winning, as she does in Hand That Rocks the Cradle or Fatal Attraction. Nobody in this film. Inside, arguably the childless woman wins, but it's not really clear that she's actually a human. You know, she's a vengeful spirit, possibly an undead kind of figure. She kills the mother and ends up sat there with the baby. So there's an ambiguity, but the childless women are still the monster. Now, I think it's a really positive development. You know, when you think about films like The Babadook, which are prepared to show parenthood can be a nightmare, that it can be very difficult, that being a mother isn't some kind of wonderful state of peace and tranquility. But I feel like involuntarily childless women are still caught in a kind of conceptual trap. And that's what I want to look at really in this talk. So when you think about Fatal Attraction and the audience reception to that back when it first came out, the audience absolutely hates Alex, and they are guided towards that by what the film is, you know, consciously trying to tell you. It's interesting if you read Anna Bogutskaya's book, what's it called? Unlikable Female Characters. She talks about Fatal Attraction and how the original ending, which makes a lot more sense when you watch the film, is that Alex ends up killing herself, but it's off screen. And she does it in such a way that Dan is framed for her murder. So the film originally ended with him being led away by the police for murdering her. When they showed that to test audiences, the audiences were not satisfied. They weren't satisfied with her dying off screen, and they weren't satisfied with Dan having any consequences, and they weren't satisfied with her being allowed to decide how she died. And so the new ending, the ending as it stands, the one that you will see, is her, as I say, put down like a dog, really. And then you will see that when the film came out, there was people clapping and cheering when she was killed at the end. With The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, I remember this coming out and I saw it as a teenager. And the most shocking scene at the time, and the one that people talked about, was not her being impaled on a fence at the end. It's when she breastfeeds the baby secretly at night. And I think this was so shocking because this woman is daring to threaten the sacrosanct nuclear family unit. She is invading someone else's private space, a private unit that no one else is supposed to be a part of. And she is taking on this intimate role with the baby. And it's interesting how shocking scenes seemed, the breastfeeding of someone else's child. This is bearing in mind that, of course, Peyton, the character, had been pregnant and lost her baby just a few months earlier, and she is actually still lactating. So she's been craving this physical intimacy with a baby since losing her own. And you think about the fact that wet nurses were such a common thing until 150, 200 years ago. The fact that it was actually quite standard, certainly for wealthier women or middle class women, to hire someone else to feed their child while they were out, or even for working class women to hire someone else to feed their child while they were working and so on. But at some point in the last couple of 100 years, the ideological role of the family has changed to the extent that this is now seen as something that's very taboo. Of course, it is to do it without consent, but it feels more shocking than it should be. It's worth just showing the last few shots of Fatal Attraction, where the new ending as it stands just really reinforces this point about the family and the role, and why this woman who's tried to invade it is so monstrous. So in the top left, there's Alex being shot by the wife, and then it goes straight to the next scene, which is Dan shaking hands with the homicide detective outside, assuring him that this is all fine, he won't get in any trouble, it's self-defense. It then cuts to him hugging his wife, and then the camera pans in to focus in on the family photo, reassuring us all that the family unit is intact and together and no longer under threat. So far, so straightforward. I think we can expect the dominant ideas in society, which privilege the family and the family units over everything else, which talk about it as this like nuclear, enclosed, private space. This is how people would look at films like this or characters like this. But I feel like these characters are also damned by those who are critical of the family or the patriarchal order. So Barbara Creed, in her book, The Monstrous Feminine, from 1993, the classic work, she dismisses these kinds of films and these figures as not very interesting. She says this version of the female psychopath represents a more conventional view of female monstrosity, in that woman transforms into a monster when she is sexually and emotionally unfulfilled. She seeks revenge on society, particularly the heterosexual nuclear family, because of her symbolic castration. Yeah, and that applies. Yeah, she's talking about Fatal Attraction, Hand That Rocks the Cradle, so Poison Ivy and Single White Female, two other films from that time that are about younger women who are also lacking a family unit and trying to steal someone else's life. Now, it's absolutely fair, of course, that Creed wanted to focus on other kinds of characters, on the castrating woman rather than the castrated one, the one that's threatening patriarchal order, not trying to be part of it. It's also true that these films were made in a particular context. So Susan Faludi talks about Fatal Attraction and films like it as well. Films in which emancipated women with condominiums of their own slink wild-eyed between bare walls, paying for their liberty with an empty bed, a barren womb. And this is absolutely Alex in Fatal Attraction, in her industrial chic loft apartment in the meatpacking district of New York. Now, these films are undoubtedly part of the conservative reaction against women's liberation from the 1980s and 90s. And they show this kind of career woman who now faces the consequences of her lifestyle choice. And these women are dispensable because of that. It's also just the childless women in general. In The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, the main character, the mother, has a best friend played by Julianne Moore, who is a child-free by choice career woman who's mostly interested in fashion, money, traveling. She's a good friend to her, but she is constantly seen as a threat, like, will her husband have an affair with her? And then she is murdered quite quickly by Peyton, the nanny. She's not allowed to live. She's also childless, and she's not allowed to live through this film. So I think the criticisms that come from feminist writers are absolutely fair and accurate, but it does leave these characters and this issue of involuntary childlessness in a kind of limbo. It's like, to one kind of audience, they're simply villains or monsters who threaten the status quo, and to another, they're just boring Freudian ciphers or represent reactionary political ideas that reinforce the status quo. But what I really noticed when rewatching and watching other films for the first time was how much I was asking, where is the support for these women in these films? In Fatal Attraction, Alex is apparently alone. She talks about having had a bad miscarriage the previous year. She says, when she gets pregnant, she says to Dan, I'm 36 years old. This could be my last chance to have a child, because, of course, he wants her to have an abortion. The extent to which she is focused on this made me think, was she trying to conceive? Did she pick Dan as someone that because she knew she needed to have sex that weekend because she was ovulating, and really it was later when she felt they had some kind of connection that she wanted to insist on this relationship lasting longer. But either way, she apparently has no family, she has no friends or therapists or whatever to support her. In The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, the opening scenes are actually really quite moving. Because we see at the beginning of the film our main character, the mother, going to the gynecologist where she's assaulted, and then tells her husband, and they report it. And so then the actions that flow from that lead Peyton, his wife, and then widow, to lose her baby in distress. The baby dies, and she's given an emergency hysterectomy. And so in the beginning of the film, these two series of events are intercut. So we've got Peyton in hospital losing her baby and her womb, intercut with the happy family shots in main family's house. And then later on, we get when a few months later, when Peyton has turned up as this nanny, we see her constantly framed in doorways. There's several times in which she's framed in doorways, looking in at scenes of family life that she's excluded from. And this one in particular, where she's watching the mother breastfeeding, and she feels this kind of physical pain, because that's something that her body wants to be doing, doesn't have a baby to do that with. It's really tragic. And yet there's not really any room in the film after this point for the viewer to have sympathy with her, because she's, very quite nasty, quite icy, manipulative, racist, and various other things, as well as violent and so on. In Involuntary, we see Sylvia, the character who we saw in the first slide, going through her scrapbook of her experiences, the picture of the bloody stillborn baby, one of several that she's had, the form where her application for to adopt was refused because she's a single parent, or would be a single parent. And so even though she has privilege and she's quite wealthy, she's still not able to adopt a child in a Catholic country where you have to be married. The nanny in Lullaby, the French film, we learn had a husband and child, and the husband left her and took the child and stopped her from being able to see them. Inside, Femme, the mysterious woman, and her unborn child were killed in a car crash, just as she was escaping from what sounds like an abusive relationship. So in every single one of these films, there's quite a horrible backstory of abuse, neglect, and pregnancy loss and trauma in various ways that isn't dealt with. And these characters are then stuck in this position of mother to be, but never being mother. So it's not the character of these women that is monstrous, but the social factors that have led them to this behaviour. The trauma, the lack of support networks, the abusive relationships, the loneliness. When I was thinking about the issue of loneliness, it made me think of the Rose Glass's film Saint Maud, which really deals with the question of loneliness and mental health. But in that film, I think you're encouraged to feel sympathetic towards the main character, even though she's the one who is causing a danger to other people. In all of the films I watched, even the more recent ones, there's really no sense of sympathy that is kind of seems to be encouraged for these characters. And I think in our society, the fact that there is very little support outside of the family is the key. It's very difficult to live outside of the structures of the family. It's also difficult to live inside them for lots of people. COVID-19, the cost of living crisis, all of these things have added to that sense of how much pressure there is on the family and people looking for alternatives to that, but those alternatives aren't really supported at the moment. And when it comes to childlessness and infertility, there's a shame and stigma associated with that. Because there's this failure to meet the expectations of society. Shame about a body that hasn't functioned in the way that I think it's meant to. And this is where I found it quite useful and illuminating to look at some of the recent writing by trans and intersex writers with a different perspective on bodies and bodies that fail. Particular Willow Maclay and J. Wallace Skelton. So there's a collection of feminist writings on pregnancy loss, which has a chapter by J. Wallace Skelton, who is a trans man who has experienced pregnancy loss as well as successful pregnancy. And he notes that people would ask him questions that were really loaded with transphobic assumptions. Did you miscarry because of the hormones that you take? Is it because you're trans, basically? Exposing the fact that, well, miscarriage is actually really, really common. It's estimated that 1 in 4 pregnancies end in miscarriage, early miscarriage, that is. So it's a really, really common experience for lots and lots of people, but it's one that isn't really talked about. And what J. Wallace Skelton writes about is how he'd learned from a young age that failure is an inherent part of being human, of having a body. And he found solidarity and comfort in talking to other people who'd experienced pregnancy loss. He said, it felt like there was a giant conspiracy of silence around miscarriage, and the silence had fostered shame and blame, and guilt, and the sense that everyone else had perfect bodies that did what was wanted of them. Suddenly we were imperfect together. You know, the key here is this sense of solidarity, this sense of removing shame from the situation and understanding that this is a common experience that lots of people with different kinds of bodies would experience. You know, there's this shame and guilt attached to the idea that everyone else is normal and functional, and you're not somehow. And it's a consequence of the abjection of everything that is messy, that is not straightforward. This ideological construction of what is correct and what is a failure, you know, and what is fits with this current social order and what doesn't. And I think in all of the films that I've looked at, the women are set against each other as competitors, winners and losers. You know, there's no solidarity and there's no allies for these women who are coming from these traumatized places. I think that one of the really useful points in Erin Harrington's book, in Gynae Horror, is about the myth of the ideal body. It's the ideological role of that myth. The idea that there is even such a thing as an optimally functioning body. It's an ideological idea. Bodies are messy. They fail. They do unexpected things. And the idea that all or most of us can ever meet some kind of standardized notion of normality is really problematic. And it's a notion that leads to shame, that undermines women's and other marginalized people's relationship to their bodies and their understanding of their bodies. And it positions normal functions as dysfunctional. So, you know, something like premenstrual stress is treated as a disorder, you know, something that needs to be fixed so you can get back to work. Or the menopause is this terrible ending of the main part of your life, where instead of the opening up of a new stage of life, and actually an increasingly long stage of life in the world today. The idea of the optimally functioning body is also one that kind of further marginalizes people who are already excluded from mainstream discussion. And it's just worth noting that in all of the films I looked at, and often in discussions of involuntary childlessness, it tends to be framed around kind of middle class families, you know, with a big house, a big empty house in Sylvia's case, or a big happy family house in the case of the mother figures in Fatal Attraction, The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. In Lullaby, it's a very nice apartment in central Paris. And in Inside, it's a big, stylish class home that this widowed woman lives in. And all of the families are white, although, of course, in Elementary, there's a question of class differences and ethnicity that is raised. In both of the French films I looked at, there's a kind of shadow of discussion around racism and police violence and Lives Matter type things going on in the background, but not addressed in the main body of the film. The final thing that I wanted to talk about is the question of science and reproductive technology and Dead Ringers, the remake of Dead Ringers, because I do think it's very interesting. just put this slide here because I found this amusing. In the first episode, you get the usual warning. It's a 15, rated 15 for nudity, violence, substance use, alcohol use, smoking, foul language, sexual content. But then there's this massive extra warning about, we're about to depict childbirth, so, be really scared. I would say the first episode is quite jarring because it's this very medicalized um, version of childbirth. And so there is a lot of blood. There's also, it looks very sterile and clean and unmessy. And it's kind of shocking because it's something that we don't normally get to see, despite this being, a process that happens millions of times a day. Um, so Dead Ringers deals with the gallbladder. But the other path is to try and use reproductive technologies to have a baby if your body hasn't been able to do that on its own. Now, there's a whole chapter in Erin Harrington's book about science, the application of science, which talks a lot about, the men of science and how these have been portrayed in film over the decades. What's interesting in Dead Ringers is the way that they just kind of put that argument out of the way because the scientists are women, the people experimenting on our infertile women are women. The billionaire that they want to get funding from is a woman. All the lead characters in Dead Ringers are women, and mostly they're also in relationships with other women. So they take the question of gender out of it and make it very much about class, wealth, profit motive, and accessibility, and what society's attitude to childbirth, infertility, and fertility is. It's also interesting in the first episode, straight after they've had these quite graphic scenes of childbirth in their clinic, you get one of the twins, Beverly, goes to the toilet and so she's bleeding and is having an early miscarriage. And you can tell from her reaction that this is not the first time this has happened. He goes to see her twin Elliot and says, "Oh, I've lost another one. My body kills babies," is how she puts it. And that's, again, is a recurring theme when you read about miscarriage and pregnancy loss and involuntary childlessness, this way that women will blame themselves, blame their bodies, kind of almost separate off this idea of their body from themselves and blame the body for not doing what it's meant to do. I don't have time to talk so much about Dead Ringers now, and it fell slightly to the side of my main thesis, but I would really recommend that people watch it, in comparison with David Cronenberg's version from the 80s, because it is really interesting series and I think raises a lot of important questions about healthcare today, about class, about capitalism, and so on. Coming back to the idea of bodies that fail, the other writer I mentioned is Willow Maclay, who is intersex, who writes about film and stuff, and she's been part of producing a new that's about to come out in Britain anyway, about portrayal of trans people in film. But she had an essay in a collection called She Found It at the Movies, about how people's personal relationship to films, how they kind of found themselves through film. And Willow talks about the 2013 sci-fi horror Under the Skin, directed by Jonathan Glazer, which was the closest that any film had come to representing her experiences. So in that film, Scarlett Johansson plays an alien in the form of a woman who's on Earth with some kind of mission that is never really explained. and she starts to desire to experience what it is to be human. And then is kind of a bit confused and devastated when she realizes that her kind of facsimile of a body isn't able to do the things that humans do, to enjoy food, to have sex, and so on. And Maclay writes about how they were able to connect with the anxieties and the loneliness expressed by Johansson's character on screen. And the way that the character wasn't treated by the film as a mutant, but as someone whose longing could not yet be met. And that's something I think that we should think about in terms of how characters can be portrayed, who come through that kind of trauma or who don't fit into the perfect body kind of narratives. I think at the moment there is an assault on women's bodily autonomy, accompanied by this vicious backlash against the gains made by trans activists, and the notion of who decides and who can afford to decide how you live in your body. And it's difficult to discuss sometimes even issues of representing pregnancy loss in a world where women are being prosecuted for child murder after miscarrying, because of the changing abortion laws. I think that feminist new wave cinema has the potential to counter the silence in society on involuntary childlessness by kind of peeling away the facade of the family. And I think it's already doing that in terms of being willing to show the difficult side of human relationships. Think about other films like the film Revenge, for example, from a decade or so, or was it 2016, I think, about a pregnant woman whose unborn baby is telling her to kill people, made by Alice Lowe and starring her. It's such an interesting film in terms of how there are lots of gruesome images in that film. Her pregnant body is not one of them. It's about who is made a monster. It's just an interesting relationship in that film about what is made monstrous. Lots of films dealing with the family and so on, like Us, Hereditary, His House, and so on. And a lot of those films highlight the lack of social support in society and from the state and so on. From other sources outside of the family unit, and they deal with all kinds of intersecting factors like racism, mental distress, or grief, or loneliness, migration, and so on. I think this is the vein in which the issue of involuntary childlessness can be also discussed in a less conservative way, let's say. Thinking about who is the monster and thinking about the relationship to the body and the idea of the body that fails. Because I think you can make characters who are chaotic and extreme in their behaviour, and characters who will not be ignored, which is another iconic line from Alex in Fatal Attraction. I will not be ignored, Dan. But these characters shouldn't have to be set against the other women in the films, set against the mother. I think another really good point in Erin Harrington's book is about how there isn't really such a big division between, the fertile woman and the infertile woman, or the trans man who's experienced pregnancy and the cis woman who has, or the child moving to adolescence, the childless man who's culturally invisible. All of these people have different relationships to each other and aren't like simply separated. And it should be possible to find those links, to find mutual support without, you think about, at the moment, the message from horror films is, and possibly from society, is if you want to find support in a difficult situation, you move to Sweden and join a cult, like Florence Pugh in Midsummer. You know, that's what she was craving. She was craving support and couldn't find that among her peers in the United States. I think horror as a genre is a very good place to help break taboos and silences about difficult subjects like involuntary childlessness without simply making these characters monstrous because of their actions. And so I found that looking into this subject, I didn't find yet any great examples of what I would like to see, but I do think that all of the work that is taking place in this area suggests ways forward to deal with this issue in a way that doesn't either reinforce or avoid the question of the family and how it's portrayed on film in our society.
Wow, thank you so much. Um, I'm a little bit speechless because I really thought it was beautiful and went so many different unexpected places. Um, in your last 2 minutes, unfortunately, you answered my question, which was going to be that you mentioned that some films do manage to evince sympathy from the viewer in this regard, but do you sh know any that truly show a system of support? And I think, well, you kind of answered with Midsummer in a joking way, but yeah, it's true. The cult as kind of an alternative to the family is sort of like an extreme sort of like this grotesque representation of like how dysfunctional the nuclear family system is and how far people go to find an alternative. Um, but yeah, anyway, we're very open for questions. We have about a half hour, so there's lots of time if people want to engage. You can also say comments or remarks. Or we can also just sit in silence for a bit and digest.
Okay, I have a little question. Somehow, while listening to your wonderful talk, I was thinking of how the hag is also portrayed in horror, and how, are there some? Did you see a lot of similarities in how the involuntarily, childless people, women, and the hag is portrayed in horror and in general? Like, I'd be interested in that.
I mean, one of the things that partly inspired me to do this topic was going to the talk about hags at the festival. Was it last year, I think? And I can't remember the speaker's name, but she referred to Erin Harrington's book, Gynae Horror. And in that book, there's a very good chapter about hags, the older women over 40, who are portrayed in particular ways, and obviously portrayed as no longer fertile. I think when I was trying to delineate my research, I was constantly coming up against, trying not to tip over into looking at hags because they have already kind of been studied to some extent. It tends to refer to postmenopausal women. So I wanted to try and find those characters who are not postmenopausal, so they haven't moved to a different stage of life. Although Sylvia in Involuntary is on that border, I guess. Because I felt like it's this group of women who are, like they feel like they should be fertile, but they're not. And that was kind of the group I wanted to look at. But it's absolutely relevant, a lot of the discussion around that last kind of points that I was talking about, in terms of how there isn't this great division. A point I think Harrington probably makes this point is that you talk about a fertile woman, an infertile woman, but actually anyone who has a womb is only fertile for a few days a month. and only from when they start their period until their period ends. And periods and fertility can be affected by illness and weight and, you know, all kinds of other factors as well. And so actually a lot of the time, most of the time are not about to drop a baby or get pregnant, you know. So there isn't actually this clear division between who is fertile and who isn't. And I think that's a useful point in terms of the way that society will try to categorize women and separate them into different boxes. And I think the point I would like to see is just try and stop doing that and to allow people to see the similarities between themselves and other people instead of the differences, I guess. But I think, yeah, there's a lot of overlap, and there was a great chapter as well in another collection, Uncontrollable Bodies, about kind of middle-aged women in horror films from the 50s, you know, who turn into wasps or creatures of some sort, and it's kind of a metaphor for menopause and stuff like this, and that also felt very relevant to a lot of the things I was looking at, but I think I was also trying to kind of not tread on ground that had already been done too much as well.
Thanks.
Just looking at the questions in the chat.
Yeah, if people want to also turn on their mics and ask the questions themselves, you're welcome to do that. If not, I can also just read them out loud. So I'll read the first one here. It's yeah, from John Ann Klein. What is, in your opinion, the film with the most personal perspective of a woman?
You mean from the ones that I've talked about, or just in general?
I
Hi.
can explain. Hi. Yeah, you talked not just from the movies you talked about. I'm always looking for the movies, like you talked about different movies with different kinds of women and different kind of stories, and some movies which is like really from like told by the woman herself, and the really personal story from the really few from the woman. I don't know if you have some movies in mind.
I might have to think about that for a few minutes, and I'll try and come back
Yeah.
before the end of the session.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I can't think of any off the top of my head.
I have a quick question. You drew a lot of really interesting parallels, also between involuntarily childless women and trans people, intersex people. I was wondering if you also thought about disability in that context and like productivity culture, and I mean you talked about that as well, but if that was also something that you thought might be an interesting parallel.
It's a really interesting parallel. I didn't look into it for this thesis, but I think it's absolutely something that would flow from it, because it comes from that, you know, that the section on bodies that fail and how we reframe the idea of failure. And of course, disability can relate to fertility and stuff as well, and absolutely in terms of perceptions around fertility, or, you know, ideas that are placed on other people around what they may or may not be able to do. So I think that it's a really crucial question. It's not one that I examined, but now I want to, now that you mentioned it. Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. I'm seeing another question in the chat about, I guess, just your overall perspective on the film, the interior or inside.
Yeah, I didn't talk about that very much. I think it's an interesting film. It had a real physical effect on me when I watched it. It's It's very bloody. I don't know if people have seen it, and I guess it's part of the new French extremity. And so, it's not holding back on the horror. It really is just a battle inside the home over the course of a night, where the mysterious woman is trying to physically cut the baby out of the other woman's belly with a pair of scissors. Um, it's interesting because I think in some ways it's left a bit ambiguous exactly what is happening in the film. I included it in my set of films because on one level you can see it as a woman whose pregnancy has ended, her unborn baby has been killed, and she wants to steal this other pregnant woman's baby. But I think that she was also killed, and so therefore is an undead figure or spirit or zombie type person. So not technically an involuntary childless. And I think it's also possible to read that film as less of a battle between two different people and more about the experience of changing from being a pregnant woman to being no longer pregnant and having a baby, to look at parent, So I think in one sense, I kind of ended up thinking that the film is actually a metaphor for that transition from being pregnant to being postpartum and becoming a parent. And in the case of this film, the pregnant woman, her husband was killed in a crash. So she's facing parenthood alone, as and is traumatized and hasn't really dealt with the grief of losing her partner. So I think to me it felt like it had a lot of fairy tale elements to it, symbolic elements. Both the characters, they mirrored each other very much, in this battle that takes place overnight. And when I thought about it, it almost ended up that I decided it was almost like an accidental prequel to the Babadook, because it almost feels like it's describing the situation that we hear about happening in the past in the Babadook. In Babadook, she's a parent of a 6 or 7-year-old who has clearly never had the time and the space since giving birth to deal with the grief of losing her husband in a car crash on the way to the hospital in that film. And so she's then got these 6 years of just trying to raise a child in the midst of grief that's not been dealt with. And this film is about a woman who's just lost her husband in a car crash whilst pregnant, and is facing prospects of parenthood without being able to deal with that grief. And in the course of the film, the mysterious woman who comes to try and steal the baby and succeeds in the end, also kills, the woman's support system. She kills her mum, she kills the police, she kills, her friend who's come round to see if she's okay. So it's a really brutal film that kind of could be read in various ways. I think for me, I ended up theorizing it out of my set of films in a way, because I ended up deciding that the mystery woman was more of a metaphor than a real person. Yeah.
I'm wondering, like, obviously this talk is about this theme through the lens of horror. Like, is there a way that the topic of involuntary childlessness can be explored through horror in a way that isn't inherently kind of like filled with this sense of hopelessness about the society that we live in?
Mm.
Like, I'm wondering about like what kind of transformative vision of this can exist. I mean, of course, horror is extremely expansive and it's like there's a lot of room
Mm.
for reimaginings of things, but I would like to hear your thoughts on like how can we turn it from being this like lamenting the the situation that currently exists into something different, something outside of this.
I mean, I guess there's a couple of steps, because first of all, I would just like to see some sympathy encouraged for these characters. So I was thinking about the film Saint Maud and how it's very bleak, of course. It's a young woman with mental health issues and probably trauma from a specific event that happened at work, and who doesn't have a support network, even though her job is as a carer, trying to provide support for other people. And it's about loneliness and the rest of it. It's still very bleak, she still dies in the end, but manages to do that, to show all of these issues without making her a monster. And I think in some ways the first step, because my issue with all of the films that I could find that specifically dealt with involuntary childlessness as a key theme, that there weren't any where you felt like the film was trying to make you sympathize with the involuntary childless woman. The only improvement was in showing that mothers aren't always perfect. This was the only advancement in the period that I looked at. So first, there could still be films that are, dark and grim and whatever, but at least don't make, or don't shy away from explaining why this woman is the way she is. I think it's interesting because all of the films kind of do explain to some extent. And when I was rewatching Fatal Attraction, I don't know how you can watch it and not have sympathy for Alex. I mean, I ended up with a whole theory that she's autistic as well in this one. But there's quite a lot in it, and obviously Glenn Close's performance is really powerful. So there's quite a lot of emotional connection if you're not obsessed with upholding the family and so on. I think in terms of other possibilities, it's tricky, isn't it? One thing that I started looking at is the issue, the concept of abjection, which has been a big, popular and well-used concept in social theory and cultural studies, and has been relevant in horror studies, since the 90s. And this idea of what is abjected in society, what is not okay, what is waste, what is not to be touched, and so on. And that in horror or horror studies, we tended to, see this in a positive way. What is abject is good to us, we want to see the abject. We want to celebrate the hag or, the angry woman and the rest of it. A book that came out last year called Art Monsters by Lauren Elkin. She's looking at artists in general, so that might be film, visual art, and so on. And she's calling for, maybe we should stop celebrating abjection, in the sense that maybe we should stop assigning abjection to ourselves as female bodies or marginalized bodies, and accepting the monstrosity that society wants to tell us, wants to assign to us, and so on. So instead, celebrating glorious ambiguity is how she puts it. I think, thinking through these kind of ideas, I haven't yet come up with a solution to that question, because obviously we're talking about horror films. Horror films need horror. We can't, I would also like to see general, sensitive drama that dealt with involuntary childlessness in a good way, because they don't really exist either. Maybe that's a better place to deal with a subject that doesn't get discussed. But in terms of the way that horror films can express those feelings of desperation and madness that women or men as well, trying to conceive who can't, feeling the kind of desperation that a character like Alex, Peyton, Hannah Rock's Cradle, what they kind of embody, but in a way that doesn't make them kind of the character that you hate. I think that's what I would like to see, films that are able to express desperation of not being able to do a thing that you do this really key thing that you want to do, but which also might find that there are other answers. So the thing that's popping into my head is, I guess, like at the end of The Witch, where she just goes off and joins the coven or whatever. And it's like, I can't make this family work. It's going to go and join the other side. That's also a kind of unacceptable. I suppose it's a bit like Midsummer, but it's a way of saying you don't have to find a solution inside the family. Maybe there isn't one. Maybe there's something else out there. I think that's the kind of area that could deal with this sort of issue.
Yeah, maybe a coven is a bit better than a cult in this case.
Maybe.
Or there's room for both, let's say, and more beyond it. Um, Anyone else have anything they want to add in? Then, Sally, how can people reach you if they want to ask you something later?
I mean, I'm on Instagram, so that the details should be. I
They're on
can't
the
actually
final
remember the name.
Instagram as well.
Yeah. So yeah, it should be there. I think it's just my name really. Sally Campbell with an S on the end, and you'll find me on Instagram. Um, yeah, and if people have suggestions or answers to any of those questions, I'd be really happy to hear them as well, because it's something I'm still thinking about. So thank you.
I think we all have a lot to think about now,
Yeah.
and really thank you so much for delivering this work here.
Thank you.
For rolling in from the crowd as well. All right, then we will close this talk and we'll be back at 8 for a workshop. And then we're here again as well tomorrow, again from 4 until 10. So, of course, that's Central European time. And yeah, thanks again and enjoy your night.